Hello, this is Morel Bernard with the continuation of the story, Styles. Poirot, the amazing detective. Let's go. And by the way, please subscribe to the channel. I would appreciate it if you would do so. And please share the videos. So, without further ado, Styles. Last words were, as a detective, his flair had been extraordinary, and he had achieved triumphs by unraveling some of the most baffling cases of the day. He pointed out to me the little house inhabited by him and his fellow Belgians, and I promised to go and see him at an early date. Then he raised his hat with a flourish to Cynthia, and we drove away. "He's a dear little man," said Cynthia. "I'd no idea you knew him." "You've been entertaining a celebrity unawares," I replied. And for the rest of the way home, I recited to them the various exploits and triumphs of Hercule Poirot. We arrived back in a very cheerful mood. As we entered the hall, Mrs. Ingerthorpe came out of her boudoir. She looked flushed and upset. "Oh, it's you," she said. "Is there anything the matter, Aunt Emily?" asked Cynthia. "Certainly not," said Mrs. Ingerthorpe sharply. "What should there be?" Then, catching sight of Dorcas, the parlour maid, going into the dining room, she called to her to bring some stamps into the boudoir. "Yes, ma'am." The old servant hesitated, then added diffidently, "Don't you think, ma'am, you'd better get to bed? You're looking very tired." "Perhaps you're right, Dorcas. Yes. No, not now. I've some letters I must finish by post time. Have you lighted the fire in my room as I told you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then I'll go to bed directly after supper." She went into the boudoir again, and Cynthia stared after her. "Goodness gracious, I wonder what's up," she said to Lawrence. He did not seem to have heard her, for without a word he turned on his heel and went out of the house. I suggested a quick game of tennis before supper, and Cynthia, agreeing, I ran upstairs to fetch my racket. Mrs. Cavendish was coming down the stairs. It may have been my fancy, but she too was looking odd and disturbed. "Had a good walk with Dr. Bornstein?" I asked, trying to appear as indifferent as I could. "I didn't go," she replied abruptly. "Where is Mrs. Inglethorpe?" "In the boudoir." Her hand clenched itself on the banister. Then she seemed to nerve herself for some encounter, and went rapidly past me down the stairs across the hall to the boudoir, the door of which she shut behind her. As I ran out to the tennis court a few moments later, I had to pass the open boudoir window, and was unable to help overhearing the following scrap of dialogue. Mary Cavendish was saying in the voice of a woman desperately controlling herself, "Then you won't show it to me." To which Mrs. Inglethorpe replied, "My dear Mary, it has nothing to do with that matter." "Then show it to me." "I tell you it's not what you imagine. It does not concern you in the least." To which Mary Cavendish replied with a rising bitterness, "Of course I might have known you would shield him." Cynthia was waiting for me, and greeted me eagerly with, "I say, there's been the most awful row. I've got it all out of Dorcas." "What kind of a row?" "Well, between Aunt Emily and him. I do hope she's found him out at last." "Was Dorcas there then?" "Of course not. She happened to be near the door. It was the real old bust-up. I do wish I knew what it was all about." I thought of Mrs. Rake's gypsy face and Evelyn Howard's warnings. but wisely decided to hold my peace, while Cynthia exhausted every possible hypothesis and cheerfully hoped Aunt Emily will send him away and will never speak to him again. I was anxious to get hold of John, but he was nowhere to be seen. Evidently, something very momentous had occurred that afternoon. I tried to forget the few words I had overheard, but do what I would, I could not dismiss them altogether from my mind. What was Mary Cavendish's concern in the matter? Mr. Inglethorpe was in the drawing-room when I came down to supper. His face was impassive as ever, and the strange unreality of the man struck me afresh. Mrs. Inglethorpe came down last. She still looked agitated, and during the meal there was a somewhat constrained silence. Inglethorpe was unusually quiet. As a rule, he surrounded his wife with little attentions, placing a cushion at her back and altogether playing the part of the devoted husband. Immediately after supper, Mrs. Inglethorpe retired to her boudoir again. "Send my coffee in here, Mary," she called. "I've just 5 minutes to catch the post." Cynthia and I went and sat by the open window in the drawing-room. Mary Cavendish brought our coffee to us. She seemed excited. "Do you young people want lights, or do you enjoy the twilight?" she asked. "Will you take Mrs. Inglethorpe her coffee, Cynthia? I will pour it out." "Do not trouble, Mary," said Inglethorpe. "I will take it to Emily." He poured it out and went out of the room carrying it carefully. Lawrence followed him, and Mrs. Cavendish sat down by us. We three sat for some time in silence. It was a glorious night, hot and still. Mrs. Cavendish fanned herself gently with a palm leaf. "It's almost too hot," she murmured. "We shall have a thunderstorm." Alas, that these harmonious moments can never endure. My paradise was rudely shattered by the sound of a well-known and heartily disliked voice in the hall. "Dr. Bornstein," exclaimed Cynthia, "what a funny time to come." I glanced jealously at Mary Cavendish, but she seemed quite undisturbed. The delicate pallor of her cheeks did not vary. In a few moments, Alfred Inglethorpe had ushered the doctor in, the latter laughing and protesting that he was in no fit state for a drawing-room. In truth, he presented a very sorry spectacle, being literally plastered with mud. "What have you been doing, doctor?" cried Mrs. Cavendish. "I must make my apologies," said the doctor. "I did not really mean to come in, but Mr. Inglethorpe insisted." "Well, Bornstein, you are in a plight," said John, strolling in from the hall. "Have some coffee and tell us what you have been up to." "Thank you, I will." He laughed rather ruefully as he described how he had discovered a very rare species of fern in an inaccessible place, and in his efforts to obtain it had lost his footing and slipped ignominiously into a neighbouring pond. "The sun soon dried me off," he added, "but I'm afraid my appearance is very disreputable." At this juncture, Mrs. Inglethorpe called to Cynthia from the hall, and the girl ran out. "Just carry up my dispatch case, will you, dear? I'm going to bed." The door into the hall was a wide one. I had risen when Cynthia did. John was close by me. There were therefore 3 witnesses who could swear that Mrs. Inglethorpe was carrying her coffee, as yet untasted, in her hand. My evening was utterly and entirely spoilt by the presence of Dr. Bornstein. It seemed to me the man would never go. He rose at last, however, and I breathed a sigh of relief. "I'll walk down to the village with you," said Mr. Inglethorpe. "I must see our agent over those estate accounts." He turned to John. "No need, sit up. I will take the latchkey." To make this part of my story clear, I penned the following plan of the first floor of Styles. The servants' rooms are reached through the door B. They have no communication with the right wing, where the Inglethorpes' rooms were situated. It seemed to be in the middle of the night when I was awakened by Lawrence Cavendish. He had a candle in his hand, and the agitation of his face told me at once that something was seriously wrong. "What's the matter?" I asked, sitting up in bed and trying to collect my scattered thoughts. "We are afraid my mother is very ill. She seems to be having some kind of fit. Unfortunately, she has locked herself in. I'll come at once." I sprang out of bed and, pulling on a dressing gown, followed Lawrence along the passage and the gallery to the right wing of the house. John Cavendish joined us, and one or two of the servants were standing round in a state of awe-stricken excitement. Lawrence turned to his brother. "What do you think we had better do?" Never, I thought, had his indecision of character been more apparent. John rattled the handle of Mrs. Inglethorpe's door violently, but with no effect. It was obviously locked or bolted on the inside. The whole household was aroused by now. The most alarming sounds were audible from the interior of the room. Clearly, something must be done. "Try going through Mr. Inglethorpe's room, sir," cried Dorcas. "Oh, the poor mistress." Suddenly, I realized that Alfred Inglethorpe was not with us, that he alone had given no sign of his presence. John opened the door of his room. It was pitch dark, but Lawrence was following with a candle, and by its feeble light we saw that the bed had not been slept in, and that there was no sign of the room having been occupied. We went straight to the connecting door. That too was locked or bolted on the inside. What was to be done? "Oh dear, sir," cried Dorcas, wringing her hands. "Whatever shall we do?" "We must try and break the door in, I suppose. It'll be a tough job, though. Here, let one of the maids go down and wake Bailey and tell him to go for Dr. Wilkins at once. Now then, we'll have a try at the door. Half a moment, though. Isn't there a door into Mrs. Cynthia's rooms?" "Yes, sir, but that's always bolted. It's never been undone." "Well, we might just see." He ran rapidly down the corridor to Cynthia's room. Mary Cavendish was there, shaking the girl, who must have been an unusually sound sleeper, and trying to wake her. In a moment or two he was back. No good, no good. That's bolted too. We must break in the door. I think this one is a shade less solid than the one in the passage." We strained and heaved together. The framework of the door was solid, and for a long time it resisted our efforts. But at last we felt it give beneath our weight, and finally, with a resounding crash, it was burst open. We stumbled in together, Lawrence still holding his candle. Mrs. Inglethorpe was lying on the bed, her whole form agitated by violent convulsions, in one of which she must have overturned the table beside her. As we entered, however, her limbs relaxed, and she fell back upon the pillars. John strode across the room and lit the gas. Turning to Annie, one of the housemaids, he sent her downstairs to the dining room for brandy. Then he went across to his mother, whilst I unbolted the door that gave on the corridor. I turned to Lawrence to suggest that I'd better leave them now, that there was no further need of my services, but the words were frozen on my lips. Never have I seen such a ghastly look on any man's face. He was white as chalk. The candle he held in his shaking hand was sputtering into the carpet, and his eyes, petrified with terror, or some such kindred emotion, stared fixedly over my head at a point on the further wall. It was as though he had seen something that turned him to stone. I instinctively followed the direction of his eyes, but I could not see anything unusual. The still, feebly flickering ashes in the grate, and the row of prim ornaments on the mantelpiece were surely harmless enough. The violence of Mrs. Inglethorpe's attack seemed to be passing. She was able to speak in short gasps. "Better now. Very sudden. That's stupid of me, to lock myself in." A shadow fell on the bed, and looking up I saw Mary Cavendish standing near the door with her arm around Cynthia. She seemed to be supporting the girl, who looked utterly dazed and unlike herself. Her face was heavily flushed, and she yawned repeatedly. "Poor Cynthia is quite frightened," said Mrs. Cavendish in a low, clear voice. She herself, I noticed, was dressed in a white land smock. Then it must be later than I thought. I saw that a faint streak of daylight was showing through the curtains of the windows, and that the clock on the mantelpiece pointed to close upon 5 o'clock. A strangled cry from the bed startled me. A fresh access of pain seized the unfortunate old lady. The convulsions were of a violence terrible to behold. Everything was confusion. We thronged round her, powerless to help or alleviate. A final convulsion lifted her from the bed, until she appeared to rest upon her head and her heels, with her body arched in an extraordinary manner. In vain, Mary and John tried to administer more brandy. The moments flew. Again the body arched itself in that peculiar fashion. At that moment, Dr. Bornstein pushed his way authoritatively into the room. For one instant he stopped dead, staring at the figure on the bed, and at the same instant, Mrs. Inglethorpe cried out in a strangled voice, her eyes fixed on the doctor. "Alfred! Alfred!" Then she fell back, motionless, on the pillars. With a stride, the doctor reached the bed, and seizing her arms, worked them energetically, applying what I knew to be artificial respiration. He issued a few short, sharp orders to the servants. An imperious wave of his hand drove us all to the door. We watched him, fascinated, though I think we all knew in our hearts that it was too late, and that nothing could be done now. I could see by the expression on his face that he himself had little hope. Finally, he abandoned his task, shaking his head gravely. At that moment we heard footsteps outside, and Dr. Wilkins, Mrs. Inglethorpe's own doctor, a portly, fussy little man, came bustling in. In a few words, Dr. Bornstein explained how he had happened to be passed in the lodge gates as the car came out and had run up to the house as fast as he could, whilst the car went on to fetch Dr. Wilkins. With a faint gesture of the hand, he indicated the figure on the bed. "Very sad, murmured Dr. Wilkins. "Poor dear lady. Always did far too much against my advice. I warned her. Her heart was far from strong. Take it easy, I said to her. Take it easy. But no, her zeal for good works was too great. Nature rebelled. Dr. Bornstein, I noticed, was watching the local doctor narrowly. He still kept his eyes fixed on him as he spoke. "The convulsions were of a peculiar violence, Dr. Wilkins. I am sorry you were not here in time to witness them. They were quite titanic in character." "Ah," said Dr. Wilkins wisely. "I should like to speak to you in private, Dr. Bornstein." He turned to John. "You do not object?" "Certainly not." We all trooped out into the corridor, leaving the two doctors alone, and I heard the key turned in the lock behind us. We went slowly down the stairs. I was violently excited. I have a certain talent for deduction, and Dr. Bornstein's manner had started a flock of wild surmises in my mind. Mary Cavendish laid her hand upon my arm. "What is it? Why did Dr. Bornstein seem so peculiar?" I looked at her. "Do you know what I think?" "What?" "Listen." I looked round. The others were out of earshot. I lowered my voice to a whisper. "I believe she has been poisoned. I'm certain Dr. Bornstein suspects it." "What?" She shrank against the wall, the pupils of her eyes dilating wildly. Then, with a sudden cry that startled me, she cried out, No, not that," and breaking from me, fled up the stairs. I followed her, afraid that she was going to faint. I found her leaning against the banisters, deadly pale. She waved me away impatiently. No, leave me. I'd rather be alone. Let me just be quiet for a moment or two. Go down to the others." I obeyed her reluctantly. John and Lawrence were in the dining room. I joined them. We were all silent, but I suppose I voiced the thoughts of us all when I at last broke it by saying, "Where is Mr. Inglethorpe?" John shook his head. "He's not in the house." Our eyes met. Where was Alfred Inglethorpe? His absence was strange and inexplicable. I remembered Mrs. Inglethorpe's dying words. What lay beneath them? What more could she have told us if she had had time? Join me for the next video. Join me for the next video of Styles and Poirot. Join me, Morale Bernard, for the next video. Join me for the next video. And by the way, please subscribe to the channel, please share, but join me in the next video. I'll see you then.